let me just pick a subject and start here. So math. All of our rhythm in music is based off of a mathematical series. There's a lot of math to what we do. In fact, in my teaching, I relate rhythm to math a lot to help the students understand and how the rhythm works and how everything works in kind of if you think of teaching fractions, it's very much kind of a fractional system in rhythm. So we use a lot of math in that sense. Science, we actually think a lot about acoustics. And so we actually think about the physics of how our instruments work. We also end up, as musicians, learning a lot about anatomy. And because we have to really have an understanding of how our respiratory system works, how our facial muscles come together, how our fingers coordinate. You know, one of my favorite examples is that I think most non-musicians aren't aware that we only have 4 tendons in our hands, and our ring fingers are very weak and they don't move on their own. They move off their next tendon over. So even with young students, we start learning about these things, you know, that impact us. So yeah, lots of anatomy, lots of physics. In history, we must understand history to understand music and to play it well. When we approach a piece of music, the first question in our head was, when is this written? Because something that was written by Bach in the early 1700s has a very different style than a big romantic symphony written at the end of the 1800s. You know, it's almost 200 years apart. And then if you think of the contemporary music that we're playing today, also is very different. So we not only study kind of that historical timeline and how it influences musical styles, but we also study how it related in the world. You know, what literature was being written at the same time. You know, one of my favorite kind of connections out there was Frederick the Great, you know, who we all know from history to be this kind of like very strong military man. He was actually a flute player, and he was one of the biggest proponents of music. And so he hired, you know, a dozen composers to be in his employ, and he even worked with Bach. He also was a great lover of literature. So at these times, at one of his palaces, he would have these Saturday evenings where all the great minds, I mean, would travel from all over, and he'd have dozens of composers and famous, you know, authors and everything there, and it was like this great cultural point. And when I get to perform music that actually was written for those nights, like I actually a few years ago here locally gave a concert that was just music from these nights in the palace of Frederick the Great. And it was so fascinating to understand the history and the literature and everything that influenced that. The last subject I kind of saved because it's my favorite, and it's one I've actually been working with a lot, which is how for the young grades, how music integrates with storytelling and the language arts. Music can be used to tell stories in so many very effective ways. We've done a lot of work. Here locally, I work with the Bach Festival, and we have an ensemble that we actually have gone in and done some school tours, and we're currently doing some recording projects, but we do musical storytelling for young students. Our upcoming work that we're working on is a storytelling of Hansel and Gretel. And it's based off of the Hansel and Gretel opera by Engelbert Humperdinck, and then has been written down for 5 players plus a narrator. So as the musicians, we get to set the soundscape. We get to set the sounds of what it sounds like in the story, and the narrator gets to help lead us along telling the specific story. We've done some really interesting pieces. We recently did one where it was about a pot-bellied pig, and our musicians got to be the barnyard and make a lot of connection for the students, where they could really listen to somebody tell them the story, but then hear the sounds, and it really comes alive for them, and their imaginations, I think, get taken a step further when they have both the storytelling and the music combined together. I think, obviously, like, for the young set, that literature-music connection is an obvious and strong one. There's clearly not a ton of history learning for the young set, but I mean, even just if you're thinking of, in a social studies situation, teaching, like, when is Flag Day, perhaps pair it with one of our famous patriotic songs. Obviously, holidays, often music gets tied into teaching about holidays, which is wonderful. But I think that there can be a lot of situations where perhaps, educators can incorporate music to help make the connection. Music really, and I'm sure everybody is aware of, there's great research out there to support that, music and the study of music really does wonderful things to light up our brains and help make neural pathways that connect idea. One other thing that I think is fascinating that I've read some about is that there is some thought, quite a bit of thought actually, that music really helps improve memory. And so sometimes, and even as teaching music, we sometimes can be guilty of just explaining something. So with my young students who might have a harder time remembering certain things, we might sing what that is because they remember the song. They might not remember just the words that I tell them, but they'll remember them if they're part of a song, and then they can sing it and remember what they're supposed to do.